Hi everyone, welcome back to our quick look series. So, with continuation to our existing series, right? Today I am going to talk around the Apex triggers, which is very important topic to the Salesforce developers, right? So, whenever you are working on the triggers, you need to understand what all things you need to do whenever there is a change on the record. If you handle some business logic and thereby updating the same record or the related records, right, as per the business requirement. That's where we need a business logic to be executed, and there for our help there is apex trigger, right? So there are multiple things in the apex trigger. So this is considering you have a basic understanding of apex triggers, and now we'll discuss about few general or common things that we should remember while working on the trigger. Now the first thing is always use one trigger per object. Okay. Second thing is do not write a business logic in the trigger body. Okay. Trigger should only be used to define the events, and then whatever handling for that particular event, we should always pass that control on the some other class, not in the same trigger class, right? Then trigger handler class. Okay, so that's the other class will be your trigger handler class, where you should be doing whatever business logic you want to do on that data, right? And always remember, whenever we are working on the trigger, we should always keep certain conditions. If those conditions are fulfilled, only then our trigger should run. Uh, Otherwise our trigger will go in the recursion, right? Now when we talk about recursion, there are multiple things that we need to handle. So first let's clarify these pointers. So let me try to explain with the example. Okay, here if I say there is one object. Okay, so trigger is all about handling the events on the records, right? So there can be, say, as of now I am just taking the three events, right? There can be additional event like merge. Okay, so we'll just talk about the basics. So there is the insert of record, updating a record or deleting a record. So say I, as a developer, I have created trigger 1 which will handle after insert, trigger 2 which will handle before. Likewise I have created five different triggers. Okay, now on the same object in another org, another developer has created one trigger which is handling all those events, right, in the same trigger, and it is not putting any business logic here. What it is doing, it is passing event specific details or actions to the handler method. So like this. So I have this trigger where what I have done is I have, say, handled the events. Okay, and on these events I will be calling a separate method, and to that method I'll be passing the trigger context variable. So you all must be aware of trigger context variable, right? Trigger dot new, trigger dot old map, new map, in which context which things are available, what all events are available, whether we can have after delete, before delete, is it a valid, invalid. You can always refer back to the Salesforce documentation. Okay, now if you see here, I have only one trigger, centralized code handling events, and that event specific code I am passing to the handler class, where I have written the methods, and those methods will handle the or work on this data, right? Now when we talk about this versus this, right, I'll come to that point. Okay, if suppose the other developer comes in, if these things are here or this is here, there is no issue with both this logic at initial level, right? But if suppose on the same event some developer come and he write another trigger, trigger 7, which is again on after insert. So this we should not do. We should never do this kind of thing, right? Because there is no guarantee that Salesforce gives which trigger will execute first. And if you have a code dependency, like okay, first this should execute and then this should execute, you will never get the expected result, because it is outside your control. So we should avoid this. Now the second thing is about the recursion and the things, right? So trigger on off mechanism and the trigger recursion, right? So now let us consider we have this six triggers framework. Now for I want to do a data load, and for that data load I want to skip all these triggers. I don't want this trigger to run. What I'll need to do, the only one option is I need to go and inactivate trigger. But that can I do in the production environment? The answer is no, right? So in that case you have to have some flag or variable which you can configure, right? So with the help of configuration you should be able to control this. So in that case you will have to say, when it comes to configuration we can always go to the custom metadata, because we know custom metadata queries are not counted against the limit in the SQL limit, right? So you say you have declared custom metadata and there you have kept six variables for each one for one trigger, right? So six variable you have to update and then you will be able to skip. You will have to add kind of code in each trigger. So imagine the duplication, the control, if you miss by mistake any of the variable, the impact, right? Whereas as compared to this, if you have only one trigger which is controlling all the event, you just need to skip this trigger. If you skip this, every logic, everything will get skipped. That is the one advantage, right? So with the help of this you can, even in production, with the help of custom metadata you can just configure that setting, and accordingly your trigger will be bypassed while you are doing the data load. So it depends how you want to bypass. Now that is the one scenario, data load. So where we want to bypass trigger, right? Either a data load, or if suppose conditionally, if updating a record from business logic. So say you have an account, okay, on that account you have your new attribute, and that attribute you need to update from the business logic, and while updating that you don't want any trigger to fire. So how you can control that? So in that scenario you can always use a static variable, right? So if this is your trigger, this is your business logic to update, right? And so you're updating record here, right, in the business logic. So before update and after update, what you can do, you can set some flag in your class as a static variable and refer this in your trigger to bypass, right? So how we can do that? Say for example I am here, so that will serve us couple of purposes. Either, so if you see here in this account trigger, I have this utility for recursion control and I have this method. So if I open this class, if you see here what I am doing, I have just declared some static variables and I am setting it to true false. So I can anytime go in my business logic and set this variable true false. Why? Before updating, if I set it to true, and in the logic I am skipping the code basis that if it is true then don't enter inside, if it is false then enter inside, right? So that way I can skip the code. The other point was avoiding recursion. So what happens, suppose if you don't put the conditions properly, or if in the after update or after insert you are inserting another record or updating the same object records, right? Not the same record but another records of the same object. So in that case, if your trigger doesn't have proper conditions, it will go into recursion, right? So and that recursion depth is 14 times. So when it goes into recursion, this code gets executing multiple times, and if this code has certain SQL statements, so while going into recursion, it will breach the limit, and somewhere it will give the error. So to avoid that, what we can do, whenever your code enters once in the trigger, you can set that flag to true or false, so that it will not re-enter. So this flag, great recursion control, you can here you can set it set to false. So if it is true, it is allowing to not to enter. If it is false, it is allowing. So by default, say this is false, right? That condition becomes true. Then you enter here, set to true, so that next time it won't enter here. Whatever logic you are doing inside this, because it is happening in the same context, next time it won't enter. Okay. Now the next thing is trigger on off, which I have already talked about. Using a custom metadata you can define, and then with this class, what we can do, we can access that. Now I have kept it trigger recursion, right? So for whatever object I want, I will pass that object name. I will get the details from that custom metadata, whether to execute or not. If I set it to false, it won't enter here, right? For that account object. So if it won't enter, it means it is getting skipped. So from production as well, we can update the metadata from the setup. So that's how we can control it here. Okay. Now talking about trigger logic in handler helper should always be handling bulk. So always remember, whatever trigger or apex code we are writing, we should bulkify. Bulkify meaning you must have those details. Otherwise, I'll have another quick look where I'll explain the bulkification. Okay. Now, can we call a future method from trigger? Yes, you can call that. Can you call a batch from a trigger? Yes, you can do that, right? Now there is a challenge. I have a mixed DML error. You know, whenever we are having setup non-setup objects, we get a mixed DML error. How to get away with that error? So to avoid mixed DML error, what we can do, we know the reason that if in the same context we are dealing with or DML are happening with setup and non-setup object, this error is thrown. So what we can do, to separate that transaction, we can use one execution in the future method. So that will separate out the things and it will resolve the issue. So always remember, we have to use the future method in this context. Okay, or some way of some mechanism, whether it may be platform event, future method, or queuable or anything, or we have to separate it out. Okay. Another challenge is, say if your trigger is generating an error saying future is not allowed from a future context, right? So say in your trigger here you are calling some method which is a future method. Okay. So say if this method is a future method, so in normal scenario it is working fine. Now what if I have one batch which is updating records, and from that batch I am not skipping this trigger. So when that batch executes, I enter inside this trigger, and from here I call this future method. So batch is already a future. Within future you cannot invoke future. So in that case, how to identify the context, that is important. So if you can identify context, you can write another method which is a non-future. So here you can put what is the context. So for context, simply you can see how we can identify. So from system class, we get whether the context is batch, system.isBatch, system.isFuture, right? System.isQueuable. Accordingly, you can just put the condition. You can find, okay, so in your case, if it is a batch, you can put here system.isBatch in the if condition, and simply you can put this method here. So if it is a batch, then call this method which is non-future, else call the method which is future. because with asynchronous or future we already have an increased limit, right? So that should resolve our issue. If not, then we have to find out another mechanism, but this is the simple way to identify the context, right? Based on that context you can take a call to avoid that error from your trigger. Okay, now let's move back here. Okay, so these are few important things to remember, right? What is a trigger on off mechanism, why we should be using custom metadata, because in production we cannot activate inactivate trigger, so via configuration we can control this trigger on off, and that is useful for data load. So remember, all these points are very small points and very important points while you are working on this. Always have a good knowledge around context variable, bulkification. Always remember we have to put a certain condition to avoid trigger recursion, so always put old current value check or any condition that you want to put, right? Conditionally your trigger should be handling that business logic. To these 2 points are again same one, and then there is another portion that we will speak sometime later, like whether to use a apex trigger or using a flow trigger. What is the difference, can we use those in combination or we should avoid that? All those pros and cons we'll cover in another session. So that is pretty much all for this trigger session. Hope this is useful, and please share your feedback, right? That will help me improve if any additional things I need to do to make the things or concept in a better way to understand. Okay, thank you.